Hey everyone. Tonight, we're going back to a time when the world was younger, when gods walked through olive groves and the explanations for things were written in starlight and soil. We're going to follow a story that's been told for thousands of years, but I promise to tell it to you gently, the way you'd want to hear it right now, at the end of a long day. So before we start, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, as it helps us, and let me know where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim your lights, get comfortable, and prepare to drift to the sound of Greek mythology with a campfire. This is the story of how winter came to be, how spring learned to return, how a mother's love changed the very fabric of the earth, and how a young woman discovered that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we never planned to take. Now, picture this: a world without winter. No, really. Imagine it for a moment. Every single day the temperature hovers right at that perfect spot where you don't need a jacket but you're not sweating either. The kind of weather that makes you think, I should go for a walk, and then actually do it. That was the world before our story begins. The goddess Demeter had arranged it that way. She was the goddess of the harvest, of grain, of everything that grows and feeds humanity. And she'd gotten really, really good at her job. Too good, some might say. Though who's complaining about perfect weather and unlimited fresh bread? Demeter had figured out the formula for eternal abundance. The wheat grew golden and heavy. The grapevines sagged with fruit. The olive trees produced year-round, which honestly seems exhausting when you think about it. But the trees didn't complain. They just kept going, like the world's most reliable workers, never asking for a vacation. But here's the thing about perfection. It can get a little monotonous. The farmers knew exactly what to expect every single day. Plant, water, harvest, repeat. Plant, water, harvest, repeat. No surprises, no drama. Just an endless succession of identical, gorgeous, productive days. And living right in the middle of all this abundance was Persephone. Now, Persephone wasn't interested in the technical aspects of agriculture, and who could blame her? She was young, though immortal, which complicates the concept of age quite a bit, and she spent her days doing exactly what she wanted, which mostly involved wandering through meadows, picking flowers, and generally existing in that state of contentment that makes other people slightly jealous. Her mother kept a close eye on her. Perhaps too close, if we're being honest. Demeter had poured all her considerable divine energy into two things: keeping the world fed and keeping Persephone safe. And she was excellent at both. Maybe a little too excellent. Persephone didn't mind. Not really. She loved her mother. She loved their life together. But there was something in her, some small seed of curiosity, that wondered what else existed beyond the eternally blooming meadows. Though she'd never say it out loud because, let's face it, complaining about living in paradise feels ungrateful. She had her favourite spots, of course. There was a grove of pomegranate trees where the fruit hung like small red lanterns. A field of narcissus flowers that released their perfume into the air so thickly you could almost taste it. A stream that ran clear and cold over smooth stones, where she'd sit and trail her fingers through the water, watching small silver fish dart away from her shadow. The nymphs who attended her were lovely company, in their way. They'd gossip and laugh and braid flowers into each other's hair. They'd race through the grass and dance in circles, and do all the things that young immortal beings do when they have infinite time and no responsibilities. But Persephone sometimes felt like she was watching her own life from a slight distance, like an actress who'd been playing the same role for so long she'd forgotten there were other parts she could audition for. Her mother's love surrounded her like a warm blanket. Protective. Constant, just a tiny bit suffocating. Though Persephone felt guilty even thinking it. You know how sometimes you'll take the same route to work for years. and one day you suddenly notice a building you've passed 1,000 times, but never really seen. The world of eternal spring had become like that for everyone except Demeter. Familiar to the point of invisibility. The gods on Mount Olympus, lounging around with their nectar and ambrosia, barely paid attention to the human world anymore. Why would they? Nothing ever changed down there. Same crops, same weather, same everything. Even the gods, who had literally infinite time on their hands, were getting bored. Zeus would sometimes look down from his throne and think about shaking things up, the way a bored CEO thinks about reorganizing the office just to see what happens. But then he'd get distracted by some other drama. There was always drama on Olympus, and the human world would continue its pleasant, unchanging existence. Demeter didn't notice any of this. She was too busy maintaining her perfect system, too focused on her daughter, and too invested in keeping everything exactly as it was. Change, to her mind, was just another word for risk, and risk was something she'd carefully eliminated from her domain. The humans adapted, the way humans always do. Without seasons to mark the passage of time, they created their own rhythms. Festivals based on the phases of the moon. Celebrations tied to birthdays and weddings and achievements. They marked time by generations instead of by growing seasons. They got creative because they had to. But they also forgot some things. They forgot the sharp gratitude you feel for warmth when you've been cold. The way the first strawberry of spring tastes sweeter because you've waited months for it. The particular pleasure of pulling on a soft sweater when the air turns crisp. They had plenty, but they'd lost the context that makes plenty feel like a gift. Not that they knew what they were missing. How can you miss what you've never experienced? Meanwhile, beneath the earth, way beneath it, deeper than any root system, deeper than the caves where crystals grow in the dark, there was a whole other world. The underworld, the land of the dead, the place where souls went when their time in the sunshine was finished, and ruling over this realm was Hades. Now, let's clear something up right away. Hades wasn't evil. He wasn't some horned demon cackling over a cauldron of fire. That's not how the Greeks imagined him. He was just a god doing his job, and his job happened to involve managing the dead. Someone had to do it. Someone had to keep track of all those souls, maintain order in the shadowy halls, and ensure that the rivers of the underworld kept flowing. It was administrative work, mostly. Bureaucratic. Deeply, profoundly lonely. Hades had drawn the short straw, literally, when the three brothers divided up the cosmos. Zeus got the sky and basically got to be in charge of everything. Poseidon got the seas and could at least surface now and then to enjoy some sunshine and flirt with nymphs. And Hades got the underworld, which didn't come with much in the way of perks. He performed his duties with grim efficiency. He was good at it, actually. Fair. Impartial. The dead respected him in their own quiet way. But respect doesn't keep you warm at night, metaphorically speaking. The underworld was perpetually twilit, silent except for the whisper of souls and the distant sound of rivers flowing. No birdsong, no laughter, no flowers, obviously. Hades had started to feel like a shadow himself. He wasn't supposed to leave his realm very often. The rules about that were pretty strict. But every once in a while, he'd hitch up his chariot, pulled by 4 magnificent black horses that breathed smoke and moved like darkness given a form. And he'd rise up through a crack in the earth to visit the world above. Just to remind himself what light looked like. What colour was it? What it felt like to stand under an actual sky instead of a ceiling of stone. On one of these rare excursions, he saw her. The day started like every other day in the eternal spring. Persephone woke to sunshine streaming through her window. She stretched. She dressed in something light and flowing. Immortals don't really need to worry about fashion, but they do anyway. She ate some honey-drizzled figs and fresh bread that somehow tasted exactly like it had yesterday, and would taste tomorrow. Her mother was already up, of course, tending to some agricultural matter that required her divine attention. Something about wheat yields in Thessaly. Or was it great production in Thrace? Persephone had stopped keeping track, so Persephone wandered out into the morning, accompanied by her usual group of nymphs, and headed toward her favourite meadow. The one with the narcissus flowers. They were in bloom, which they always were, but somehow today they seemed more fragrant than usual. Sweeter. Almost intoxicating. She waded into the field of white flowers, feeling them brush against her legs, their perfume rising around her like visible air. The nymphs scattered across the meadow, laughing and calling to each other, their voices blending with the sound of bees and the whisper of grass moving in the breeze. And then Persephone saw it. Right in the centre of the meadow, where there had definitely not been anything special before, grew a single flower unlike any she'd ever seen. It was massive, for one thing. The bloom was the size of her head, with petals that seemed to shift colour as she looked at them, purple, melting into deep blue, melting into a red so dark it was almost black. The stem was thick and strong, and the whole thing seemed to pulse with its own light. She glanced around. The nymphs hadn't noticed. They were too busy with their own flower gathering at the edges of the meadow. Persephone walked toward the impossible flower. Each step felt significant somehow, though she couldn't have said why. The morning seemed to hold its breath. Even the bees stopped humming. She reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the petals, the earth opened. It didn't crack. It didn't rumble with warning. The ground simply ceased to be solid, the way ice becomes water, the way a door swings open. One moment, Persephone was standing in a meadow full of sunshine and narcissus flowers, and the next moment, she was falling through darkness. She didn't scream. There wasn't time. The fall happened too quickly, and it felt too much like dreaming, that sensation of weightlessness, of reality becoming unstuck. And then there were horses. 4 of them, massive and dark, their breath like smoke, pulling a chariot made of black stone that gleamed like wet obsidian. And standing in that chariot, holding the reins with steady hands, was a figure dressed in darkness itself. Hades caught her, not roughly but firmly. He guided her into the chariot beside him with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence of what had just happened. And then, without a word, he urged the horses onward. They plunged deeper. The crack in the earth sealed itself above them, shutting out the light like a closing eye. Persephone gripped the edge of the chariot and tried to make sense of what was happening. Tried to understand why her heart was hammering in her chest, but she wasn't actually afraid. Or maybe she was afraid, but it was mixed with something else, something she didn't have a name for. Curiosity, maybe. Or the strange exhilaration that comes from knowing your life has just changed completely, and you can never go back. They descended through layers of earth, through stone and soil, through caves where blind fish swam in underground lakes, through tunnels carved by water over millions of years. The horses never slowed. Hades never spoke. And Persephone, for the first time in her life, didn't know what was going to happen next. The air grew cooler, then cold. Then not exactly cold, but absent of temperature entirely, as if warmth was a concept that didn't exist here. The darkness was absolute, but somehow Persephone could still see. The chariot glowed with its own faint light, and the horses seemed to carry illumination with them, like moving shadows that define the space around them. And then they emerged into the underworld proper. The underworld wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't fire and brimstone, no lakes of burning sulphur or demons with pitchforks. It was simply quiet. Vast, filled with a soft grey light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The landscape stretched out in all directions, plains of silver grass that didn't quite look like grass, hills that rose and fell like frozen waves, and rivers that flowed but made no sound. And everywhere, moving through this twilight realm, were the souls of the dead. They weren't scary. They looked like people, just more transparent, more distant. They moved with purpose, but no urgency, walking along paths that Persephone couldn't see, headed toward destinations she couldn't guess. They didn't seem unhappy exactly, just finished, complete, done with the messy business of living and now engaged in whatever it is that souls do when their time is over. The chariot finally slowed, then stopped in front of a palace that seemed to grow directly out of the ground. It was made of dark stone, polished smooth, with pillars that rose like the trunks of impossible trees. It wasn't decorative or showy, it was functional, austere, and somehow deeply impressive. Hades stepped down from the chariot and then, with surprising courtesy, offered his hand to help Persephone down. She took it, partly because she needed the help, and partly because she was curious what a god's hand would feel like. It was warm, which surprised her, solid, real. She looked at him properly for the first time. He was tall, which most gods were, but not in that exaggerated way that made you crane your neck. His face was serious, not angry, not cruel, just deeply serious, like someone who'd seen enough that jokes felt beside the point. His eyes were dark, and when he looked at her, she felt truly seen for the first time in her life. Not as Demeter's daughter, not as a lovely ornament in the eternal spring, just as herself, whoever that was. He gestured toward the palace. Inside, the palace was surprisingly comfortable. High ceilings, yes, but not cathedral vast. Halls that branched and curved in ways that suggested organic growth rather than architectural planning. And everywhere, that same soft grey light that didn't cast shadows because it came from all directions at once. Hades led her through corridors lined with doors. Persephone wondered what was behind them. Offices? Bedrooms? Storage closets for spare souls? She didn't ask. Her voice seemed to have temporarily relocated to somewhere in her chest, where it sat, waiting to see what happened next. They entered a large chamber that might have been a throne room, except it felt more like a study. There was a throne, yes, carved from a single piece of black stone. But there were also shelves lined with scrolls, tables covered with what looked like ledgers, and a general atmosphere of busy organization rather than imperial grandeur. Hades finally spoke. His voice was deep and quiet, like distant thunder or a cello played in another room. What he said was simple enough. She would stay here. She would be his queen. The loneliness of ruling the underworld was too much to bear alone, and he had chosen her to share it with him. Persephone felt something inside her shift. Not quite anger. She'd never been very good at anger. Something more like recognition. This wasn't a request. It wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. She'd been plucked from her life like that impossible flower she'd reached for, transplanted into darkness without being asked if she wanted to go. And yet there was something in her that didn't immediately want to leave. Some part of her recognized this moment as the thing she'd been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. Change, risk, the unknown. Everything her mother had carefully kept away from her. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She simply stood in that strange throne room in the kingdom of the dead and felt her life split cleanly into before and after. Above ground, Demeter was having the worst day of her immortal life. She'd returned from Thessaly, or Thrace, whichever one it was, to find the meadow empty. The nymphs were there, confused and worried, talking over each other as they tried to explain what they'd seen. Or rather, what they hadn't seen. One moment, Persephone was there, reaching towards something in the grass. The next moment, gone. Simply gone. as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Which, to be fair, it had. Demeter's panic was immediate and absolute. She called her daughter's name. She searched the meadow, the surrounding fields, the groves, and the streams. She questioned the nymphs again and again, hoping they'd remember some crucial detail they'd forgotten. She scoured the landscape looking for any sign, any clue. Nothing. She expanded her search. She left her domain, which she never did, and began travelling across the world. She walked roads and climbed mountains and waded through rivers. She asked everyone she met, gods, nymphs, mortals, even animals, if they'd seen her daughter. Most hadn't. Some offered sympathy. None had answers. Days passed, then weeks. Demeter's panic hardened into something darker. Grief mixed with rage, forming a volatile compound that would have consequences for everyone. Because here's the thing about Demeter. Her power was tied to her emotional state. Her ability to make things grow, to maintain the eternal spring, to keep the world fed, all of it flowed from her. And as her grief deepened, her power began to falter. The wheat in the field stopped growing. The grapevines stopped producing. The olive trees, which had never taken a break in recorded history, suddenly went dormant. The eternal spring, maintained for so long with such careful attention, began to crack like a facade. The temperature dropped. At first, the mortals thought it was just a weird day. Cooler than usual, nothing to worry about. They put on an extra layer and went about their business. But the coolness didn't stop. It kept going. Day by day, degree by degree, the temperature fell. The grass, which had always been green, began to fade. The flowers, which had bloomed without ceasing, started to close up and wither, and then, one morning, there was frost. The farmers came out at dawn to find their fields covered in white crystals that melted when touched, but left the plants they'd touched damaged and limp. They'd never seen frost before. They didn't have a word for it. They stood in their ruined fields and tried to understand what they were looking at. The gods on Olympus noticed, of course. Kind of hard to miss when the entire world starts changing. Zeus sent messengers to Demeter, asking her politely if she could maybe get back to work. She ignored them. He sent more messengers with less polite requests. She ignored those too. Because what did she care about the world's crops when her daughter was missing? What did it matter if mortals were cold or hungry when Persephone was gone? They could all freeze and starve for all she cared. Nothing mattered except finding her child. She continued her search with single-minded intensity, paying no attention to the chaos spreading in her wake. She'd become a force of pure maternal devotion, scorching the earth not with fire but with absence. Where she walked, things died. Not because she willed it, but because all her life-giving energy had turned inward, focusing on her grief. The world learned what winter was. Meanwhile, Persephone was adjusting to her new reality with the kind of practical acceptance that surprises people when they discover it in themselves. The underworld was strange, yes, quiet and grey and filled with the dead. But it wasn't horrible. It was just different. Very, very different from the eternal spring she'd known her entire life. Hades left her alone, mostly. He had work to do. The administrative tasks of the underworld apparently never stopped. And he seemed to understand that she needed space to process what had happened. But he'd appear at mealtimes, sitting across from her in a dining hall that was surprisingly cosy, given the circumstances. They'd eat in silence at first. Then gradually, they began to talk. He wasn't what she'd expected. He was serious, yes, but not grim. He had a dry sense of humour that caught her off guard. When she made a joke about the underworld's interior decoration, or lack thereof, he actually laughed. It was a rusty sound, like a door opening after years of being closed, but it was genuine. He told her about his work, about the responsibility of shepherding souls, of maintaining the delicate balance of the afterlife. He spoke of it not with pride, but with a kind of resigned dedication. It was his burden, yes, but it was also his purpose. Someone had to do it. She found herself talking to him in return, about the eternal spring, about her mother's protective love that sometimes felt like a beautiful cage, about the feeling she'd had right before the earth opened that her life was about to start for real. Days passed, or what passed for days in a realm without sun. Persephone explored the palace, discovering rooms she didn't know existed, a library filled with scrolls containing the stories of every soul who'd ever lived. A garden, yes, a garden in the underworld, where strange pale plants grew without light. A balcony that overlooked the fields of asphodel, where ordinary souls wandered in their peaceful, purposeless eternity. She still missed the sun. She missed colour. She missed her mother, though that feeling was complicated by other feelings she was still sorting through. But she didn't feel like a prisoner, exactly. More like someone who'd opened a door they didn't know was there and found an entirely different house on the other side. The palace had a kitchen, which seemed funny when you thought about it. The dead didn't eat, but Hades, being a god, still needed sustenance, and apparently he'd maintain this small reminder of the living world. Persephone had been invited to eat with him, but she'd always declined. Not because the food wasn't good. The underworld's kitchen somehow produced meals that rivaled anything she'd eaten in her mother's realm. Fresh bread that steamed when broken open. Honey that glowed gold even in the grey light. Fruits that looked like they'd been picked that morning from trees that didn't exist here. She didn't eat because she'd heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. If you ate food in the underworld, you were bound to it. You couldn't leave. It was one of those rules that seemed arbitrary until you thought about it. And then it made a kind of mythological sense. Consumption as contract. You become part of what you take into yourself. So she'd politely declined every meal, accepting only water, which apparently didn't count. And Hades had never pushed, never insisted. He'd simply had food prepared and placed before her, then waited to see what she'd do. But on this particular day, she'd lost count of how many. She was hungry. Properly, deeply hungry in a way she hadn't been before. And sitting on the table in front of her was a pomegranate. Not just any pomegranate. The underworld version. The skin was a deeper red than any she'd seen, so dark it was almost purple. When Hades cut it open, slowly, carefully, with a small knife that caught the grey light, the seeds inside glowed like rubies, like drops of captured light, like tiny hearts. They looked at each other across the table. She saw the question in his eyes, unspoken but clear. This was a choice. He wouldn't force her. He'd brought her here without asking. Yes. But this? This was entirely up to her. She thought about her mother, searching the world above, grief-stricken and desperate. She thought about the eternal spring, the safety, and the predictability. She thought about this strange kingdom of shadow and silence, and the serious God who ruled it with unexpected gentleness. She reached out and took 6 seeds. Just 6, though the pomegranate held hundreds. She placed them in her palm, watching how they caught the light. They were beautiful. They were a decision. They were a door closing and a different door opening. She ate them, one by one. They were sweet and tart and complicated, the way real things are, the way life is when it's not being carefully managed and protected. Hades didn't smile, exactly, but something in his face softened. Relief, maybe, or recognition. The understanding that she'd chosen to stay, at least partially, that she'd seen his kingdom and hadn't run. Back in the world above, things had gotten dire. The crops had failed completely. The trees stood bare and skeletal against grey skies. The temperature had dropped so low that water froze in the streams, forming this bizarre, solid substance that the mortals kept trying to figure out. Ice, they'd eventually call it, but right now they just called it the curse. Because that's what they thought it was. A curse from the gods. Punishment for some unknown transgression. They sacrificed what little food they had left, burning it in temples and praying for forgiveness. They didn't know that their suffering was just collateral damage from a mother's grief. Zeus, watching from Olympus, finally admitted that this couldn't continue. The humans were dying. The world was broken, and Demeter showed no signs of stopping her search or relenting in her grief. He needed to intervene, which he hated doing because it meant admitting that he'd lost control of the situation. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, the only one who could move freely between all the realms, to investigate, to ask around, to find out what had actually happened to Persephone. Hermes, who was clever and quick and generally good at his job, started by questioning everyone who might have seen something. The nymphs, useless, they'd seen nothing. The local farmers, equally useless. Various minor deities who might have been passing through, mostly useless, though one river god mentioned seeing Hades' chariot emerging from the earth around that time, which was unusual. That was the thread he needed. Hermes followed it down, making connections, asking more pointed questions. And eventually, the truth emerged. Hades had taken her. The king of the underworld, lonely and tired of his isolation, had spotted Persephone in her meadow and decided she'd make a suitable queen. It wasn't exactly kidnapping by the standards of the gods. They had different rules about these things and looser interpretations of consent, which doesn't make it right, but does make it historically accurate to the stories. But it was close enough that Zeus knew he had a problem. Hermes travelled to the underworld to confirm the story. The meeting happened in that same throne room where Persephone had first stood. Zeus sent Hermes as his representative. Smart, since the king of the gods showing up personally would have made the whole thing feel more like an invasion. Demeter came too, of course, having finally learned where her daughter was. She'd wanted to charge in immediately, to tear the underworld apart stone by stone until she found Persephone. Zeus had talked her down, barely. Hades received them with perfect courtesy. He offered them seats, refreshments, and all the proper hospitality. Demeter refused everything, standing rigid with barely contained fury. Hermes accepted some wine, because he was Hermes and he was thirsty. And then Persephone entered the room. Demeter made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Relief and rage and love all compressed into a single syllable. She moved toward her daughter, arms outstretched, ready to embrace her and then immediately drag her back to the world above, where she belonged. But Persephone held up her hand, stopping her mother mid-stride. She looked different. Not dramatically so. She was still herself, still had the same face, the same eyes. But there was something else there now. A certainty. A groundedness. She'd found some core in herself that hadn't existed before, or had existed but hadn't been tested. She'd eaten the pomegranate seeds, she told them. 6 of them. She'd made her choice. The room went silent. Even Hermes stopped drinking his wine, which was saying something. Demeter's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Shock, betrayal, confusion, back to rage. She turned on Hades, ready to unleash divine fury that would crack the underworld's foundations. But Zeus, speaking through Hermes, stopped her. The law was clear. Eating food in the underworld bound you to it. Persephone couldn't leave permanently, but perhaps, and here Hermes demonstrated why he was so valuable as a diplomat, perhaps a compromise could be reached. They negotiated like gods who'd learned not to trust each other, which they were. Each side had leverage. Demeter could and would let the entire world die if her daughter wasn't returned. Hades had the law on his side. Persephone had eaten the seeds, and the binding was real. And Persephone herself, who everyone kept forgetting to actually consult, had her own preferences that were more complicated than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The solution, when they reached it, felt inevitable in retrospect. A split custody arrangement, more or less, dictated by the number of seeds she'd eaten. 6 seeds. There are 12 months in a year. For 6 months, Persephone would return to the world above, to her mother, to the light. For 6 months, she would remain in the underworld with Hades. It wasn't perfect. No compromises. Demeter wanted her daughter back completely. Hades had hoped she'd choose to stay permanently. And Persephone? Persephone had discovered that she wanted both. The light and the darkness. The familiar safety of her mother's love and the strange new partnership she'd found in the shadows. But it would work. It would have to work. The terms were set. The agreement was sealed with the kind of divine bureaucracy that ensures promises are kept even when you'd rather break them. And then came the practical question. When would she leave? Now, Demeter insisted. Immediately. She'd been searching for months. The world was dying, and she wanted her daughter back right now. Persephone looked at Hades. Something passed between them. Not spoken, just understood. She'd return, the look said. This wasn't goodbye forever, just goodbye for now. She embraced her mother, feeling the relief and desperation in Demeter's grip. She nodded to Hermes, who'd been remarkably patient through the whole negotiation. And then, with one last glance at the kingdom of shadows that had somehow become home, she let herself be led back toward the light. The journey up was nothing like the journey down. No chariot, no horses, no dramatic plunge through the earth. Just Hermes guiding them, Persephone and her mother through the winding paths that led from the underworld to the surface. They walked through the grey twilight, past the wandering souls who barely glanced at them. They crossed the river Styx, where the ferryman Charon nodded in acknowledgement but didn't stop them. They climbed through caves that grew gradually less dark, where the air shifted from that temperatureless void to actual cold. Demeter held her daughter's hand the entire time, as if afraid she'd disappear again if contact was broken. She kept turning to look at Persephone, studying her face, trying to find what had changed. Trying to understand how her daughter could have stayed in that dark place, could have eaten food that bound her there, and could have made a choice that meant they'd be separated for half of every year. She didn't ask these questions out loud. Not yet. There'd be time for questions later. Right now, she just needed to get her daughter back to the light. They emerged at dawn. The crack in the earth opened like a gentle exhale, and suddenly they were standing in the meadow where it had all begun. The same field of narcissus, though now the flowers were dead, brown stalks sticking up through frost-covered ground. Persephone felt the sun on her face for the first time in months. It was sharp and bright and wonderful and overwhelming. She'd forgotten how intense the world could be, how loud, how colourful, how alive. Demeter stood beside her daughter and felt her power returning. The relief of having Persephone back began to thaw the frozen grief that had locked away her abilities. She could feel the earth responding to her again, ready to bloom. But it would take time. The damage was too severe to fix instantly, even for a goddess. The world would need to wake slowly from its unwanted sleep. Over the next several weeks, the world transformed. The temperature began to rise, though gradually. The ice melted into water that soaked into the thirsty ground. The frozen earth softened, becoming workable again. And then, slowly, green began to return. Not everywhere at once. It started with small shoots in protected places. A crocus pushing up through the mud. A bud forming on a tree branch. Grass showing new growth at its base. The world was learning to live again, hesitantly, like someone recovering from a long illness. Demeter poured herself into the renewal. This was what she knew how to do. This was her purpose. But it was different now, harder, edged with the knowledge that it was temporary. In 6 months, Persephone would return to the underworld, and Demeter would have to let her go. That knowledge changed everything. She couldn't maintain the eternal spring anymore. It wasn't just that her power had been disrupted, though it had. It was that the perfect, unchanging abundance she created before required a peace of mind she no longer possessed. Required a certainty that she could protect what she loved. That certainty was gone. So the spring that year was different, more vigorous, almost desperate. The flowers bloomed with intensity, as if making up for lost time. The crops grew faster than they ever had, pushing up through the soil with urgent energy. Everything was too much, too green, too alive, too abundant. The mortals, who'd survived the cold winter by sheer, stubborn resilience, emerged from their homes blinking in the sudden brightness. They planted seeds in ground that was finally soft again. They tended new growth with grateful, careful hands. They'd learned something during the cold months. How to preserve food. How to prepare for hardship. How to appreciate warmth after knowing cold. Persephone spent those months with her mother, falling back into familiar patterns, but finding them changed. The meadows were the same, but she saw them differently now. The colours seemed brighter because she'd lived without them. The bird song seemed sweeter because she'd known silence. Even the simple act of walking in sunshine felt like a gift rather than a given. Her mother watched her constantly, protectively, trying to make up for the months of separation. But there was a new wariness in Demeter's love, a recognition that her daughter had become someone she didn't entirely know, someone who'd made choices that Demeter wouldn't have made for her. They didn't talk about Hades. Demeter couldn't bring herself to say his name, and Persephone didn't push. But she thought about him, about the quiet palace and the grey light and the way he'd looked at her across a table, seeing her clearly. She thought about the work he did, shepherding souls with patient dedication. She thought about returning and felt not dread, but a kind of anticipation mixed with sadness at leaving. The months passed. Summer came with its heavy warmth the way it always had. But now the mortals appreciated it. They worked in the fields under the sun and felt grateful for the sweat on their backs. They harvested crops and stored them carefully, remembering the hunger of winter. They celebrated the abundance while knowing, somehow, that it wouldn't last. As the time for Persephone's return to the underworld approached, Demeter's mood darkened. She became short-tempered and distracted. The plants responded to her emotional state, growing more slowly, the fruits ripening unevenly. It was subtle at first, but perceptible. Persephone tried to comfort her mother, tried to explain that she wasn't being taken away, that she was choosing to honour the agreement, that 6 months wasn't forever, that she'd return again in spring. But Demeter heard only that her daughter was leaving, going back to the darkness voluntarily, choosing the underworld, choosing him, over the light and safety of home. The day Persephone was to depart, Hermes arrived to escort her. He was professional about it, neither friendly nor cold, just doing his job. Demeter stood stiffly as her daughter embraced her, not quite returning the hug, her face set in lines of barely controlled grief. Persephone descended through the earth again, following Hermes through the winding paths. And behind her, above her, the world began its slow retreat into cold. The leaves on the trees, which had been green and full, began to change colour. Yellow at first, then orange, then red. They were beautiful in their dying, which nobody had expected. The mortals stopped their work to stare at the trees, transformed into flames of colour against the sky. And then the leaves fell. It happened over weeks, not all at once. The trees released their leaves in waves, carpeting the ground with colour that gradually faded to brown. The temperature dropped steadily. The grass stopped growing. The crops finished their cycle and died back, leaving stubble in the fields. The mortals harvested what they could and stored it away, remembering the lessons from the first winter. They prepared. They gathered wood for fires. They made warm clothes from wool and leather. They brought their animals into shelter. This time, when winter came, they were ready for it. And so it went. 6 months in the underworld, where Persephone learned to rule alongside Hades, making decisions about souls and their fates, walking through the grey gardens, and finding beauty in shadow. 6 months in the world above, where she brought her mother joy and watched the earth bloom in response to Demeter's happiness. Each transition brought change. When Persephone descended, autumn came, then winter. The world withdrew into itself, resting. When she ascended, spring returned, then summer. The world exploded into life, growing and producing and celebrating existence. The mortals adapted. They learned to read the signs. When the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, they knew Persephone had returned to the underworld. Time to harvest, to prepare, to settle in for the cold months. When the first green shoots appeared and the ice began to melt, they knew she'd returned to her mother. Time to plant, to tend, and to take advantage of the growing season. They created new celebrations around these transitions. Festivals to mark the planting season, when Persephone brought spring. Harvest festivals came when autumn came and she descended again. They built their lives around the rhythm of her journey, up and down, light and dark, presence and absence. The gods on Olympus watched this new pattern establish itself and decided it was acceptable. Not ideal. Zeus would have preferred the old eternal spring, which had required less management, but workable. The mortals weren't dying en masse anymore. Demeter had found a way to function despite her grief, and Hades seemed, well, not happy exactly, but less lonely, more purposeful. Even Demeter, though she never stopped missing her daughter during the winter months, found something valuable in the new arrangement. The intensity of reunion each spring, the sweetness of time together when you know it's limited. The way absence can make love sharper, more present, and more intentional. She still didn't like Hades, probably never would. But she'd learned to accept that her daughter had found something in the underworld that she needed. Some part of herself that could only exist in shadow. The mortals, after several cycles of seasons, began to notice something unexpected. Winter, which had seemed like pure punishment at first, brought gifts they hadn't anticipated. The cold killed pests that had plagued their crops. The freeze broke up soil, making it easier to work in spring. The rest period allowed fields to recover their fertility, producing better yields when planting season returned. They discovered that some foods actually improved when stored through winter. The bitterness leaving greens, the starch converting to sweetness in root vegetables. They found new pleasures too. The beauty of frost patterns on windows, the silence of snow, which they'd learned to welcome rather than fear. The coziness of gathering around fires during the long dark evenings, telling stories, making music and strengthening the bonds of family and community. Winter became a time for indoor work, for weaving and crafting, for repairing tools and planning for the year ahead. For rest, which bodies and spirits needed more than they'd realized when every day had been the same perfect temperature and every season had been growing season. They learned that the world needed cycles, that endless summer would be as exhausting as an endless winter would be deadly, that the rhythm of growth and rest, abundance and scarcity, light and darkness, that rhythm was what made life rich, rather than monotonous. The philosophers among them started using seasons as metaphors. Life has its winters, they said, periods of hardship and withdrawal and waiting. But winter always ends, spring always returns. The trick is to remember that when you're in the cold and to prepare for winter when you're in the warmth. They were learning wisdom from the story playing out above their heads. From Demeter's grief and Persephone's journey and the compromise that had created the seasons. They were learning that loss and reunion, separation and return, were part of the pattern of existence. Meanwhile, Persephone was discovering who she was in the darkness. Not Demeter's daughter, not the girl from the meadow, but she herself was fully formed, with authority and purpose. She learned to judge souls with fairness, to distinguish between those who deserved punishment and those who deserved reward, to understand that most people fell somewhere in the middle. Not heroes, not villains, just humans who'd done their best with what they had. She developed a reputation for mercy tempered with justice, for seeing nuance in situations that Hades, worn down by centuries of similar cases, might have rushed through. She walked the fields of asphodel and spoke with the ordinary dead, learning their stories. She visited the Elysian fields, where heroes dwelt in eternal peace. She even ventured into Tartarus, where the truly wicked suffered their punishments and came away sobered but not frightened. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to remember what evil looked like so they could recognize good when they saw it. Hades watched her grow into her role with something that might have been pride. They'd become partners in a way neither had expected. Not just husband and wife, though they were that too, in their own strange way, but colleagues, co-rulers, two people sharing an impossible burden and finding that together it was almost manageable. They developed routines, meals shared in comfortable silence or easy conversation, walks through the underworld's strange landscapes, pointing out things they found beautiful or interesting. Long discussions about how to handle particularly complex cases, bouncing ideas off each other until they found solutions. The loneliness that had driven Hades to take such drastic action in the first place had eased. The underworld felt less like a prison and more like a kingdom. Still austere, still serious, still grey and quiet, but now it was home to both of them for half the year. Persephone missed the sun during those months, missed colour and warmth and the feeling of grass under her feet. Missed her mother, though that relationship had become more complex. But she didn't regret her choice. The 6 pomegranate seeds had bound her to the underworld, yes, but they'd also freed her to become someone more complete than the girl who'd spent eternity picking flowers in an unchanging spring. And then spring would come, and she'd ascend again into light. The transition never got easier. Your eyes have to readjust to brightness after months of grey. Your skin has to remember how to feel the sun. Your heart has to open again to the chaos and colour of the living world. But every year she managed it. Every year she'd emerge from the earth and see her mother's face transformed by joy. Every year the world would respond to their reunion by blooming with renewed vigour. Persephone brought things back from the underworld, though nothing physical. She brought perspective, an understanding of endings that made beginnings sweeter, a knowledge of what lay beyond life that made life itself more precious. She'd seen what came after, and it wasn't terrible, which freed people to live more fully in the present. She told stories sometimes, carefully edited, about the underworld, about the souls she'd met and the lessons she'd learned, about the work of shepherding the dead and maintaining the afterlife. The mortals listened, fascinated and comforted. Death wasn't the enemy they'd imagined. It was just another kingdom, another part of existence, with its own rules and rhythms. Her mother didn't want to hear these stories. Demeter would change the subject whenever Persephone mentioned the underworld. would find urgent agricultural matters that required attention, would suddenly remember something that needed doing elsewhere. She couldn't bear to think about her daughter in that dark place, couldn't reconcile the Persephone who returned each spring with the queen of the dead she'd become. But gradually, over years and decades and centuries, Demeter softened. The sharp edges of her grief wore down. She began to see that her daughter hadn't been stolen so much as she'd found herself. That the girl who returned each spring was more whole than the one who'd been taken. That sometimes love means letting go, even when it hurts. Something else happened over time, subtle but significant. The underworld and the upper world, which had always been completely separate, began to influence each other in new ways. Seeds that fell to the ground in autumn when Persephone descended would rest in the dark earth all winter, in a kind of underworld of their own, before sprouting in spring when she returned. The cycle of death and rebirth that governed human souls began to mirror itself in the plant world. Things had to die to be reborn, had to end to begin again. The mortals planted their dead in the ground, returning bodies to the earth. They developed rituals that honoured both aspects of Persephone, the spring maiden and the underworld queen. They understood, in a way their ancestors hadn't, that these weren't contradictory roles, that you could be both bringer of life and guardian of death, that the two were connected, necessary opposites that defined each other. Hades and Demeter never became friends. That would be asking too much. But they reached a kind of détente, a mutual respect born from sharing the thing they both loved. They'd nod to each other during the transitions when Hermes guided Persephone between realms. Brief acknowledgements that they were on the same side now, however reluctantly. Zeus, watching from Olympus, was satisfied. The compromise had held. The seasons had become part of the world's rhythm. The mortals had adapted, and the drama, always his primary concern, had died down to manageable levels. But the real victory wasn't political or practical. It was personal. Three beings, Demeter, Persephone, and Hades, had found a way to honour their needs and desires while recognising the needs and desires of others. They'd created a pattern that hurt, yes, but hurt less than the alternatives. They'd learned that perfect happiness isn't possible, but meaningful happiness is. Centuries passed. The mortals lived and died in their generations, each one learning about seasons from their parents, passing the knowledge to their children. The festivals became traditions, became customs, and became the unquestioned way things were. Nobody remembered the eternal spring. It had become a myth, a golden age that may or may not have actually existed. But Demeter remembered, and Persephone remembered, and Hades remembered. They were immortal, after all. Time moved differently for them. Each cycle was the same and different. The pattern repeated: descent, winter, ascent, spring, summer, autumn, repeat. But within that pattern were infinite variations. Some winters were harsher than others, reflecting particularly difficult separations. Some springs were more glorious, marking especially sweet reunions. Persephone grew into her dual nature with increasing ease. She learned to carry both roles simultaneously, rather than switching between them. She was always both the spring maiden and the underworld queen, just as she was always both Demeter's daughter and Hades' wife. The contradictions that had seemed impossible at first became the foundation of her strength. She taught the younger gods and goddesses who came to her for advice that you could be more than one thing, that you could hold multiple truths at once, that the self wasn't a single fixed point, but a constellation of possibilities, and you didn't have to choose just one star. Hades changed too, though more subtly. The grim seriousness that had defined him softened around the edges. He learned to appreciate beauty in small moments. he started to see his kingdom not as a burden but as sacred work. Having someone to share it with had made all the difference. And Demeter learned the hardest lesson of all. That love doesn't mean possession. That being a good mother meant supporting her daughter's choices, even the ones that caused her pain. That Persephone's happiness mattered more than her own comfort. So here we are, thousands of years later, living in the world that Persephone's choice created. Every spring that arrives after winter. Every harvest that comes before the cold. Every cycle of planting and reaping, growing and resting, light and darkness. These are all echoes of that ancient story. The seasons that govern your life, that determine when you plant your garden or when you pull out your winter coat, that shape the rhythm of the year, these came from a mother's grief and a daughter's courage and a compromise between the upper world and the lower. Think about that. The world changes because people change. Because relationships evolve. Because sometimes what seems like a catastrophe is actually a transformation. When winter comes and the world seems dead, remember that Persephone is in the underworld, doing necessary work, growing in ways that require darkness. When spring returns and everything blooms, remember that she's ascended again, bringing with her the wisdom she gained below. You live in a world of cycles because they lived through change. You experience rest and growth, endings and beginnings, because they learned that these things are necessary, that you can't have eternal spring without losing something essential, that the price of never losing anything is never growing. Let's bring this to a close now, gently, the way evening settles over a landscape. Persephone is still making that journey, up and down, light and dark, mother and husband, spring and winter. She'll make it tomorrow and the day after and every day forward, because that's the nature of cycles. They continue. Demeter is still releasing her daughter twice a year, and it still hurts, and she's still learning to be okay with that hurt, because it comes with joy too. The hurt and the joy are woven together now, inseparable, like roots and branches. Hades is still ruling the underworld, but he's not alone anymore. Half the year, he has a partner, someone who sees him clearly and chooses to return. That's worth the loneliness of the other half. And the world keeps turning through its seasons, following the pattern they established so long ago. Winter will come again. Spring will follow. The cycle continues because once upon a time, 3 immortals learned to compromise, and the earth herself learned to rest and wake, in an endless rhythm that sustains everything. Your own life has seasons too, periods of growth and periods of rest, times when you're in the light and times when you're walking through shadow, moments of separation and moments of reunion. This is normal. This is how it's supposed to work. This is the pattern. So as you drift towards sleep now, let yourself rest in the knowledge that cycles are natural. Those endings lead to beginnings. That spring always comes even after the longest winter. That you contain multitudes, just like Persephone. You can be more than one thing, hold more than one truth, and love more than one place. Let yourself sink into the comfort of knowing that the world has rhythms larger than your worries. That the seasons will change whether you stress about it or not. That rest is productive. That darkness has its purpose, and that everything that falls will rise again in its own time. Tomorrow, the sun will come up, the way it always does. The earth will keep turning. The seasons will continue their ancient dance, and you'll wake refreshed, ready for whatever part of the cycle you're in, knowing that it won't last forever, neither the hard parts nor the easy parts. And that's exactly as it should be. Sleep well. Spring will come. And so, the story ends, as all good stories do, with everyone changed but continuing. With problems solved but new ones emerging. With the world a little different than it was before, shaped by the choices of those who dared to change it. Rest now. The seasons will keep watch while you sleep.